The morning Roland Crane had his wife escorted out of the building that bore her mother's name, he was watching from the mezzanine with his arms crossed, certain he had just solved a problem. He hadn't. He had just started one. Vivian Ashworth Crane walked through that lobby slowly, not because she was broken, but because she had recently had the hip surgery her husband spent 2 years telling her she didn't need. She was using a cane. The security guard, a man named Gerald who had worked that desk for 11 years and who always asked about her garden, was looking at the floor. Roland's girlfriend, his VP of Communications, a woman who had spent the last 2 years helping him quietly erase the name Ashworth from every slide deck, press release, and internal document the company produced, was standing near the elevator, watching. And Roland's mother had called him the night before to encourage what she described as a clean break. They were all there, and not one of them looked at the plaque. It had hung in that lobby since 1994, brass letters on dark marble, right beside the front doors. Ashworth Crane Partners, Jarrierstormen, 1994. Built on the vision of Margaret Ashworth, Vivian's mother. And what Roland Crane did not know, what none of them knew as they watched her walk out, was that Margaret Ashworth had made absolutely certain 30 years ago, with 2 pages of handwritten legal architecture and a signature in blue ink, that this company was never fully his to take back. This isn't just a story about a divorce. It's about what happens when a man spends 30 years building on a foundation he never bothered to read. If you believe that patience is not the same thing as weakness, leave a like and subscribe because this story is going to show you the difference. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, to understand what Vivian was holding as she walked through those glass doors, we need to go back to where it was first placed in her hands. But first, the rest of that morning, because the cold open only showed you part of it. Roland had not come down from the mezzanine by accident. He had positioned himself there 20 minutes before Vivian arrived, the way a man positions himself at the head of a table before a meeting he intends to control. He was wearing the charcoal suit he reserved for press days and board presentations. Kristen Haas stood near the elevator bank in a cream blazer, her phone in her hand, her posture carrying the specific ease of someone who knows the outcome in advance. 2 junior staff, Marcus Webb from the development team, and a young woman named Priya Anand, who had been with the company 11 months, had been asked to remain in the lobby on the pretense of a morning briefing that had not yet materialized. Gerald had been told the previous afternoon that there would be a security protocol update first thing Thursday. He had not been told what that meant until Roland called him at 7:45 and explained in the measured tone of a man reading from a decision he had already made that Mrs. Crane's access credentials were being deactivated and that Gerald should escort her out if she came in. Gerald had said, "Yes, sir." He had not said anything else. Vivian came through the doors at 8:12. She was wearing a gray coat she had owned for 6 years, belted loosely at the waist, her dark hair pulled back with the practical efficiency of a woman who had other things to think about. The cane was in her right hand, a simple one, dark wood, no ornamentation. She had stopped being embarrassed by it 3 weeks ago when she realized she moved better with it than without it, and that the embarrassment had mostly belonged to Roland anyway. She saw Gerald's face first. She had known Gerald for 11 years. She knew what his face looked like when he was pleased to see her. A broad, unhurried smile, always followed by some version of, "How's that garden coming along, Mrs. Crane?" This was not that face. This was a man looking at the floor with a concentrated attention of someone who needed something solid to stand on. She understood before he said a word. "Mrs. Crane," his voice was low. "Mr. Crane has asked me to—" He stopped, started again. "I've been asked to collect your access card and escort you out of the building." Vivian's hand tightened once around the cane. Just once. Then it loosened. "Of course," she said. Roland's voice came from above. "Vivian?" She did not look up. "We can do this with some dignity, or we can make it complicated. That's your choice." She removed the access card from the inside pocket of her coat and placed it in Gerald's palm. His fingers closed around it immediately, as if he wanted the transaction over as quickly as possible. Marcus Webb was staring at his phone. Priya Anand was looking at the middle distance with the fixed expression of a person trying not to exist. Roland descended 4 steps on the mezzanine staircase, not all the way down, just enough to be heard clearly. "For the record," he said, and his voice had the rehearsed quality of a statement he had refined overnight. You were never a formal officer of this company. You held a spousal title, a courtesy. The role is being clarified now that our personal arrangement is changing. This is procedural. It is not personal. Procedural. The word landed in the lobby and sat there. Kristen said nothing. She did not need to. From somewhere near the elevator, audible only because the lobby had gone completely silent, she murmured to no one in particular. She was always more of a placeholder. She said it the way people say things they want heard without being held accountable for saying them. Vivian picked up the cardboard box from the security desk, her things packed by someone she would never identify. The small accumulated objects of 9 years in a building that bore her mother's name. A framed photograph, a ceramic dish she used to hold paper clips, a scarf she did not remember leaving there. Thank you, Gerald, she said. She said it the way she always said his name, like it mattered. He looked up then, just briefly. The expression on his face was not one she would describe to anyone. She walked out. The glass doors opened and then closed behind her, and the Atlanta morning was overcast and mild, the kind of gray that feels like the sky is waiting for something to happen. She sat in her car for 2 minutes. She knew it was 2 minutes because she watched the clock on the dashboard without meaning to. Her hands were in her lap. Her chest was doing something she recognized as the body's attempt to process what the mind had already moved past. She let it do what it needed to do. She did not cry. She drove to Margaret's house. Her house now, though she still thought of it as Margaret's. The way children of careful parents sometimes go on living inside the grammar of inheritance long after the inheritance itself has arrived. She let herself in through the front door, set the cardboard box on the hall bench, and stood for a moment in front of the framed document that hung beside the staircase. 2 pages handwritten. The ink faded from blue to the gray blue of old water. Her mother's signature at the bottom, clean and unhurried, the way Margaret had signed everything. Because Margaret had believed that the quality of a signature reflected the quality of the intention behind it. A signature isn't a formality. It's a promise the paper remembers when you can't. Vivian stood there for a long time. Then she walked into the kitchen, set her phone face down on Margaret's table, and did not cry. She was not sad. She was not afraid. She was something she did not yet have a word for. A specific stillness that lives at the exact moment when a decision that has been forming for years finally finishes forming. The paper was still there. It had always been there, and what was written on it had never changed. To understand what that meant and why the man on the mezzanine had been standing on ground that was never fully his, we need to go back 30 years to a construction site on the north side of Atlanta, to a woman named Margaret Ashworth, and to the afternoon she picked up a pen and made the kind of promise that outlasts everything. Margaret Ashworth did not build things to be noticed. She built them to last. That was the first lesson, and it came early. Vivian was 9 years old the afternoon her mother drove them to a construction site on the north side of Atlanta. A cleared lot on Pemberton Road, red clay soil turned up at the edges, the skeleton of a foundation poured and curing in the August heat. Margaret had stood at the chain-link fence in her good coat, which she wore on Tuesdays regardless of where she was going, and looked at the concrete with the focused attention of a woman calculating something that had nothing to do with what was visible. Vivian had asked what she was looking at. Margaret said, "The part nobody sees, the part that decides whether everything else stands." She had started Ashworth Partners in 1987 with $340,000 in capital she had assembled over 11 years from an inheritance her own mother left her, a consulting arrangement with a Buckhead developer, and 3 years of personal savings she kept in a separate account. Her first husband, Vivian's father, who left when Vivian was 4, had never known existed. Not out of deception, out of the specific wisdom of a woman who understood early that money mixed with someone else's priorities tends to become their priorities. She had learned that lesson once. She did not need to learn it again. By 1993, Ashworth Partners had completed 7 mid-market commercial projects across the Southeast and had a reputation for finishing on budget, on schedule, and without drama, which in the Atlanta construction world of that era made Margaret Ashworth quietly legendary. That was the year she met Roland Crane. He was 30 years old and running a small development consultancy out of a shared office in Midtown. He had energy and precision, and the particular gift of a man who could walk into a room full of skeptics and leave it full of believers. Margaret recognized what he was immediately. She also recognized what he was not. She was not concerned about the second part. She had Diane Sorrell draw up the papers. The founding of Ashworth Crane Partners in March of 1994 was documented in 2 handwritten pages that Margaret had drafted herself before giving them to Diane to formalize. The capitalization structure was straightforward in its architecture and unmistakable in its intent. Margaret's Ashworth Family Trust would hold 53% of the company's Class A voting shares, with the remaining 47% distributed between Roland's operating entity and a reserved employee pool. Roland's operational authority was defined in a separate employment agreement, broad, well-compensated, and entirely distinct from ownership. He had signed both documents at the table in Diane's office on Peachtree Street on a Thursday morning in March, and Margaret had watched him sign without ceremony because that was how she treated things that mattered. Vivian had been 25 that spring. She had been sitting in the corner of Diane's office, not because her presence was legally required, but because Margaret had wanted her there. Afterward, in the parking garage, Margaret had taken the folder of executed documents and placed it in Vivian's hands. Not Roland's, Vivian's. A signature isn't a formality, her mother had said. It's a promise the paper remembers when you can't. Vivian had held the folder all the way home. The early years of the company were genuinely good. Roland was everything Margaret had assessed him to be: a closer, a builder, a man who could read a site plan in a room with equal fluency, and whose hunger for the work matched her own in pace, if not in temperament. The company grew. Projects in Charlotte, in Nashville, in the emerging commercial corridor outside Birmingham. Margaret ran the asset architecture and the financial structure. Roland ran the operations and the client relationships. They were complementary in the way that good partnerships are, each one doing the thing the other couldn't without needing to explain why. Margaret had liked Roland in the measured way she liked people who were useful and honest. She had one reservation she never voiced because it was not yet necessary. She had noticed in the 3rd year of the partnership that Roland had a habit of describing the company's early vision in terms that positioned him at its center. Not dishonestly, just incompletely. She had filed this observation in the part of her mind reserved for things that were not yet problems, but might become them. She had addressed it through the capitalization structure, which was her answer to most problems she couldn't fix with a conversation. When Vivian told her mother in the summer of 2001 that she was going to marry Roland, Margaret had been quiet for a long moment before she said, "He's a good builder." Vivian had understood this to be approval. It was in its way. It was also something else. The years between then and 2018 were the years Vivian would think of as the architecture of her life. The marriage's early warmth, the company's growing reputation, the specific contentment of a woman who had built something alongside someone she trusted. Roland was different with Vivian than he was with the world. More patient, more curious, capable of a gentleness he showed to almost no one else. She had loved him for that. She had believed in it completely. Margaret's diagnosis came in January of 2018. Pancreatic, advanced. The word the oncologist used was months, and he said it with the careful precision of a man who had learned not to round up. She had lasted until October, 2 weeks before the end, on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled like the antiseptic chill of Northside Hospital's 4th floor. Margaret had asked Vivian to bring the folder. Not a specific folder. The folder. Vivian had known exactly which one. She had driven to Margaret's house, retrieved it from the filing cabinet in the study where it had lived for 24 years, and returned to the hospital room where her mother was propped against 3 pillows, still wearing her own nightgown because Margaret had not believed in hospital gowns. Margaret had held the folder for a long time without opening it. Then she had placed it in Vivian's lap and said the words again, slowly with the weight of a woman who needed to be certain they would stay. A signature isn't a formality. It's a promise the paper remembers when you can't. She had looked at Vivian with the directness that had been her defining feature since the day she stood at that chain-link fence on Pemberton Road. Then she had closed her eyes. She had not said anything else that afternoon that needed to be said. Margaret Ashworth died on a Wednesday morning in October 2019 with her daughter beside her and her affairs in order. the way she had always intended. The reception afterward was held at the house on Habersham Road. It was attended by colleagues, clients, and the kind of people whose lives had been built in part on Margaret's decisions. Roland attended the funeral. He did not attend the reception. He had a conference in Dallas, he said. It had been scheduled for months. Vivian had stood at her mother's grave in the October cold, with a folder in her bag and the particular stillness of a woman who has just lost the one person who always understood exactly what she was carrying. It was the first absence. It would not be the last. Roland's absence at the funeral reception was the first absence. It would not be the last. The changes began quietly, the way most important things do. In the first months after Margaret's death, Vivian had attributed the shifts in Roland to grief, his own version of it, different from hers, expressed through motion rather than stillness. He worked longer hours. He took more calls at dinner. He had the particular restlessness of a man who processes loss by filling the space it leaves with productivity. And Vivian, who was still moving through her own grief like a woman walking in shallow water, had given him room for it. That was what she did. She gave him room. The first presentation was a quarterly review in January of 2020. Vivian was in the back of the conference room, there in her informal capacity as she often was, when the opening slide came up on the screen. The company history, a slide that had existed in one form or another since 1994, always beginning with Margaret Ashworth's name in the first line. It was still there, but the font was smaller. The line had moved to the second position below a new header that read, Crane Group, 30 Years of Vision. Vivian looked at the slide for a long moment. She did not say anything in the room. She raised it that evening at home carefully, the way she raised things she was not certain she had the right to raise. Roland listened with the patient expression of a man waiting for a concern to finish so he can explain why it isn't one. He said the marketing team had been refreshing the visual language. He said Margaret herself had always believed the work should speak for itself. He said the name was still there. Wasn't it still there? It was still there for another 4 months, then it wasn't. Eleanor Crane had always been a manageable presence, a woman who arrived at Christmas and Easter with strong opinions about flower arrangements and table settings, whose approval of Vivian had always been conditional in ways she communicated through the particular warmth she withheld. But after Margaret died, Eleanor's visits became more frequent, and her footprint in the house expanded in ways that were difficult to name and impossible to ignore. She began appearing on Tuesday afternoons. She began offering, in the vocabulary of helpfulness, to handle things that Vivian had always handled herself. She told a colleague of Vivian's at a company luncheon in March of 2020 that Vivian had been fragile since her mother passed. She said it with the concerned softness of someone delivering a medical update. She said, "She's always been sensitive, you know, not built for pressure the way Roland is." The colleague, a woman named Sandra Obi, who had worked with Vivian for 6 years, repeated it to Vivian 3 days later, uncertain whether she was doing the right thing by saying anything. Vivian thanked her. She said she was fine. Her hands were folded in her lap beneath the table where Sandra couldn't see them. The hip pain started that summer. A deep ache at first, seated in the joint, noticeable after long periods of standing. She mentioned it to Roland in July. He suggested she was spending too many hours at her desk and needed to move more. She mentioned it again in September when it had begun waking her at night. He said grief did strange things to the body, that stress had a physical address, that she should try the yoga instructor Eleanor had recommended. He said it with genuine care, which was the part that made it hardest to argue with. She did not mention it a third time. Something else arrived that autumn. Her name was Kristen Haas, 35 years old, hired as VP of Communications in October, with a portfolio of agency work and a manner that suggested she had never once in her life been uncertain about the quality of her own instincts. She was quick, precise, and moved through the office with the forward lean of someone always slightly ahead of the current moment. Vivian had nothing against her. She noticed in the first weeks that Kristen and Roland shared a particular conversational frequency, the shorthand of two people who had already established what they thought before the meeting started. She noticed that Roland looked lighter in Kristen's presence than he had in some time. She told herself this was the relief of finding a skilled operational partner. She told herself she was reading it correctly. She was not reading it correctly, but she was not ready to read it any other way. The confirmation came on a Wednesday evening in February of 2021. Roland had left his phone on the kitchen counter and gone upstairs. The screen lit with a message. Vivian did not intend to look. She had never been a woman who looked at her husband's phone because she had never believed she was a woman who needed to. But the screen was there, and the name was there, and the message was 4 words long and entirely unambiguous in its register. She closed the screen. She set the phone face down exactly where Roland had left it. She went to the sink and ran cold water over her wrist for a moment, an old habit from childhood when she needed to slow something down. Then she made tea. She told herself it was ambiguous. She told herself she needed more than 4 words. She told herself a great many things in the following weeks, most of which she no longer believed entirely, but continued to maintain because the alternative required a decision she was not yet prepared to make. The company gala was held at the Biltmore Ballroom in September of 2021. 300 guests, a stage, a program that had taken Kristen's team 6 weeks to produce. Roland gave a speech at 9. It was a good speech. Warm, confident, self-deprecating in the way that powerful men learn to be, because it reads as humility without requiring any. He thanked the team. He thanked the clients. He described 30 years of building something from nothing, and he used that phrase, from nothing, with the ease of a man who had said it so many times it had stopped registering as a claim. Margaret Ashworth's name did not appear in the speech, not once. Vivian was seated at the secondary table, 12 feet from the stage beside Eleanor, who was wearing a brooch that had belonged to Roland's grandmother, and who had commented when Vivian arrived that the blue dress was very brave for someone who wasn't feeling her best. Vivian had smiled at this because the alternative would have required energy she was conserving for other things. She watched her husband stand at a podium in a building his mother-in-law's money had helped make possible and describe himself as the origin of everything. She watched people applaud. She watched Kristen Haas at the far end of the head table tilt her chin up with the particular satisfaction of someone who wrote the narrative and is watching it land. Vivian's hands were in her lap, still, quiet. She drove home alone. She pulled into the driveway at 11:47 and turned the engine off, and sat in the dark for a long time before going inside. She had been losing ground for 3 years. She had not yet understood that what was coming next was not the same kind of loss. What was coming next was not erosion, it was demolition, and it was already in motion. There is a particular kind of cruelty that does not announce itself. It arrives through systems, through paperwork, through the dry language of administrative necessity, and it is designed to be impossible to object to without sounding irrational. That was the kind of cruelty that arrived in 2022. Not a raised voice, not an ugly word, a declined card at a pharmacy counter on a Tuesday morning in February with 3 people in line behind her. Vivian had been standing at the CVS on Peachtree Battle Avenue, reaching for a tube of arnica gel. Her hip had been worse that week, the cold working into the joint in a way she had learned to anticipate. When the card reader beeped once and the cashier, a young man named Devin who could not have been more than 20, looked at the screen and said with genuine discomfort that it was coming up declined. Vivian had handed him a second card. Same result. She paid cash. She was precise about it, counting the bills without visible hurry, and she thanked Devin by name because she always read name tags. Then she walked to her car and sat with both hands on the wheel and breathed. She called Roland from the parking lot. He answered on the 3rd ring and explained with the patient efficiency of a man resolving a minor inconvenience that the household account had been consolidated into a new corporate structure for tax purposes. Something the accountant, a man named Hal Briggs at Meridian Accounting Group, had recommended last quarter. He said her card would be updated within a few days. He said he was sorry she had been inconvenienced. He used the word inconvenienced. A new card arrived the following week. The account behind it was structured differently. Her name was listed as secondary, not joint. Secondary. She noticed this. She raised it once at dinner carefully, the way she had learned to raise things. And Roland said that was simply how the new structure was categorized, that it made no practical difference, that she had full access to what she needed. Eleanor, who had joined them for dinner uninvited that evening, nodded from across the table and said, "Roland is so good about taking care of the practical things. You're lucky, really." Vivian looked at her plate. The health insurance discovery came 6 weeks later. She had called to authorize a referral to Dr. Patricia Lowe, an orthopedic specialist at Emory Orthopedics on Clifton Road, and the woman on the line had told her, after a long pause, that her policy had been updated and the referral would need to go through a new primary care designation she did not recognize. The update had been processed 3 months earlier. No one had told her. She pressed the woman for details, stayed calm, wrote everything down in the small notebook she had started keeping in February, without consciously deciding to do so. She could not get the referral authorized quickly. The new insurance structure required approvals from a chain of people she had no existing relationship with, each one adding a week. She paid for the appointment with Dr. Lowe out of her own account, the inheritance holding at First National Trust that Roland had no knowledge of and had never asked about because he had never believed there was anything in it worth asking about. The irony of that is worth pausing on. Dr. Lowe's assessment was direct. The hip had a labral tear that had been worsening for at least 2 years, complicated now by early articular deterioration. Surgery was not optional at this stage. It should have happened 18 months ago. Vivian had written that last part down too, underlined it once, and closed the notebook. The surgery was scheduled for March. She had arranged it entirely on her own. Meanwhile, the company's public record was being quietly rewritten. In January, the Crane Group website published a new feature, a long-form history of the company's founding, written with Kristen Haas's particular brand of architectural confidence, which described Roland as a builder who had recognized an opportunity in Atlanta's expanding commercial corridor in the early 90s and had built a 30-year legacy on the foundation of his vision and discipline. Margaret Ashworth's name appeared once in the 14th paragraph, described as a silent early investor who had supported the venture in its founding year. A silent early investor. Vivian read the piece on her laptop at Margaret's kitchen table at 7 in the morning. She read it twice. Her tea went cold. She did not call Kristen. She did not call Roland. She opened the notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page. In March, an HR notification was sent to the company's internal distribution list, advising that certain legacy title designations were being standardized as part of an organizational review. 2 presentation templates that had listed Vivian's name under founding leadership were updated. No public announcement was made. Several employees noticed. None of them said anything to her directly, but Sandra Obi sent a text that said simply, "I saw, I'm sorry." Vivian had the surgery on March 14th. Roland was at a site visit in Charlotte. She had not told him the date because she had understood by then that telling him would have produced an explanation for why he couldn't be there, and she found she preferred the clean truth of his absence to the performance of his regret. Her sister Camille drove her to Emory and stayed the night in the chair beside the bed. 2 days into recovery, they were sitting at Margaret's house, Vivian on the sofa with her leg elevated, Camille in the armchair with both feet tucked under her, the way she had sat in chairs since childhood. When Vivian showed her the org chart on her phone, Camille looked at it for a long time. "Viv." Her voice was careful. "You need to call a lawyer." Vivian set the phone face down on the cushion beside her. The cane was leaning against the sofa arm. Outside, the March light was thin and pale through the garden windows. "Not yet," she said. She believed still that there was something to salvage. She was wrong about that, but she had not yet received the document that would make it undeniable. It came on a Friday in April, delivered by courier to Margaret's house, because she had changed her primary address there after the surgery, which would matter later, though she did not know it yet. The envelope bore the name Hartwell and Crane Family Law, Roland's firm of choice, as it turned out, for the dissolution of a marriage he had decided to end the same way he had decided everything else in recent years, by presenting it as already done. Clear's throat. Vivian held the envelope for a long time before she opened it. The papers were precisely drafted, thorough. Roland had not done this quickly or carelessly. He had been planning this. The private cruelty was moving now into the open, and it intended to be seen. Now you know what she was carrying when she walked into that building on a Thursday morning in April. Now the lobby means something different. Go back to it. Walk back through those glass doors with everything you know. Roland had not woken up that morning and decided to be cruel. That is the important thing to understand. He had woken up, showered, dressed in the charcoal suit he reserved for significant days, and executed a plan he had been building for 6 weeks with the focused efficiency of a man who had convinced himself that what he was doing was simply practical. The security protocol notification had gone to Gerald at 7:45. The cardboard box, Vivian's things collected from her office by Roland's executive assistant, a woman named Tara Simmons, who had done it without comment because she needed her job, had been placed on the security desk at 8. Roland had positioned himself on the mezzanine at 8:05. He had called Eleanor at 8:10. Eleanor had answered on the first ring. She had been waiting. She was still on the phone, balanced on the kitchen counter of her Buckhead condo, when Vivian walked through the lobby doors at 8:12. Roland had not ended the call. He had simply held the phone at his side, the speaker faintly audible, so that Eleanor could listen, so she would know it was done. This is not speculation. The phone records would confirm the call's duration, 14 minutes, long enough to cover everything that happened in that lobby. Kristen had arrived at 8:08, which was 4 minutes earlier than her usual time, in a cream blazer she had not worn to the office before. She positioned herself near the elevator bank with her phone in her hand and her chin at the particular angle of a woman who has decided where she stands in a room and does not intend to move. She was not there accidentally. She was there as a witness to a transition she had helped design. Marcus Webb and Priya Anand had been told by Roland's assistant to hold in the lobby for a morning briefing. Neither of them had been given a reason. Marcus, who had worked at the company for 4 years and understood the politics well enough to recognize what he was watching, found something important to study on his phone. Priya, 11 months in and still learning the geography of the room, looked at the middle distance with the focused blankness of someone trying to be invisible. At the reception desk, a woman named Janet Okafor, who had worked that desk for 7 years and who had attended Margaret Ashworth's memorial service on her own time, kept her eyes on her screen and did not look up once. Vivian came through the doors with her gray coat and her cane, and the particular unhurried bearing of a woman who had been walking through this lobby for 20 years, and saw no reason to change her pace now. Gerald met her at the desk. The exchange was as it has already been told. The card, the quiet transaction, the floor he could not stop looking at. What has not been told is the box. Roland descended 4 steps on the mezzanine stairs. He said what he said about procedure and titles and courtesy designations. Then he nodded to Tara Simmons, who came forward from the side corridor, and placed the cardboard box on the desk in front of Vivian. It was a standard banker's box, unsealed, the flaps folded over each other. Inside the framed photograph, the ceramic dish, the scarf, a small potted succulent she had kept on her windowsill for 3 years, a copy of a report she had co-authored in 2017 that had never been credited to her publicly. Someone had packed it with care. That was the worst part somehow, the care. From the elevator bank, Kristen said something to no one in particular, her voice low and tilted toward a colleague who happened to be standing nearby. She said, she was always more of a placeholder. She said it with the ease of a woman stating a fact she has believed for a long time, and no longer sees any reason to keep private. Vivian heard it, every word. She gave no indication of this. Not a shift in her posture, not a change in her breathing, not a glance in Kristen's direction. She simply picked up the box, tucked it against her hip, and thanked Gerald by name. While she walked to those glass doors, the phone at Roland's side was still connected. Eleanor Crane was listening from a kitchen counter in Buckhead, hearing the lobby sounds, the footsteps, the silence that followed. She would tell a mutual acquaintance the following week that it had all been handled very cleanly. She meant it as a compliment to her son. Consider for a moment what none of them saw. The woman walking toward those doors was Vivian Ashworth, not Vivian Crane, not Roland's wife, not a spousal title holder or a placeholder or a legacy ornament. On every legal document that governed the company's ownership structure, on the Ashworth Family Trust capitalization table that had sat in Diane Sorrell's fireproof filing cabinets since 1994, her name was Vivian Margaret Ashworth. That was the name on the 53%. That was the name the paper remembered. He didn't see it. Not one of them did. The glass doors opened with the slight pneumatic resistance they always had, the ones Vivian had walked through thousands of times, in all weathers and all moods, since the building first opened. The April morning was gray and mild. She did not look back. And here is what the audience catches, even if Vivian does not. Parked at the curb, 20 FT from the entrance, was a white contractor's van, the kind that delivers building surveys and site assessments, common enough on any Atlanta commercial block. Snorts through the passenger window, visible for the length of one step, was a yellow hard hat on the seat. Printed on the crown in clean black letters, Meridian Capital Group, London, Site Assessment Division, Atlanta, GA. The van had been there since 7:30 that morning. It would return the following week and the week after that. The doors closed behind Vivian. The lobby resumed its morning business. Roland turned to Kristen and said, "It's done." She nodded once with the focused efficiency of a woman already thinking about the next thing. He believed it completely. He had solved the problem. He had clarified the structure. He had made the company fully his own story at last. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. That evening, the house was very quiet. Vivian had set the cardboard box on the hall bench without unpacking it. She had hung her coat. She had fed Margaret's cat. Her cat now, a gray tabby named Ellis, who had belonged to her mother for 11 years, and who had transferred his loyalty to Vivian with a dignified pragmatism of an animal who understands what permanence requires. She had done all of these things in the correct order, because order was what she had when everything else had become unreliable. Then she sat at the kitchen table and did not move for a long time. The folder was in the study where it had always been. Second drawer of the filing cabinet behind the household insurance documents in a manila envelope that had been resealed and relabeled twice over 30 years in Diane Sorrell's handwriting. Vivian did not need to retrieve it that night. She knew what was in it. She had read it in Northside Hospital in 2018, and again after the funeral, and once more in February of 2022 after the pharmacy, when she had started keeping the small notebook. She knew the trust documents the way she knew the layout of this kitchen. Not by active thought, but by the deep familiarity of a thing that has simply always been true. She retrieved it anyway. She sat back down at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of her and read the capitalization summary on page 3. Ashworth Family Trust. Class A voting shares 53.0% sole trustee, Vivian Margaret Ashworth. Her name, her birth name, not Vivian Crane, not Roland's wife, Vivian Margaret Ashworth, the same name that appeared on the founding documents framed in the hallway, the same name her mother had written on the envelope 30 years ago, with the particular deliberateness of a woman who understood that names on paper are not formalities. A signature isn't a formality. It's a promise the paper remembers when you can't. The first time those words had landed, she had been 25 years old, and they had felt like practical instruction. The second time at the hospital, they had felt like a warning she was only beginning to understand. Now sitting in her mother's kitchen with a folder of documents and a cane leaning against the table leg, and a cardboard box of her own belongings, sitting 12 FT away in the hallway, now they felt like the only solid thing left in the room. She sat with that for a while. Then she opened her laptop. The Crane Group website had been redesigned in the past 6 months. The new homepage was clean and minimal. Roland's preferred aesthetic, sharp angles, and a lot of white space. The company history section had been updated again. Kristen's piece, the one published in January, was still the lead content. Vivian read it from beginning to end for the second time, more slowly than the first. She noted the language: founder, visionary, singular, self-made. She noted what was missing. Margaret Ashworth's name appeared nowhere in the piece at all this time, not even in the 14th paragraph. It had been edited out entirely since January. She noted the org chart update still showing her own name removed from the founding leadership tier, replaced with a line that read, Advisory, Historical, Advisory, Historical. She closed the laptop. She did not slam it. She simply pressed it shut with the flat of her hand and left it there. Then something shifted, not dramatically, not the way things shift in films with music and sudden resolution. Quietly, the way a long decision finally finishes being made after years of approaching it from different angles. She had been patient because she had believed patience was love. She had been silent because she had believed silence was protection. She had been still because she had believed that stillness would eventually be recognized as the discipline it was. None of those things had been wrong exactly. They had simply reached their limit. She picked up her phone. It was 11:23 at night. She called Diane Sorrell. Diane answered on the second ring because Diane had always answered promptly and saw no reason to change this at 11:23 on a Thursday. "The shareholders' meeting," Vivian said. "When is it?" 11 days, Diane said. "The 22nd. I want to vote." A pause, not uncertainty. Diane did not pause out of uncertainty. It was the pause of a woman confirming that what she was hearing is what she thought she was hearing. "I'll have the proxy documentation ready by morning," Diane said. 9 9 S, Vivian said. She ended the call. Ellis jumped onto the table, stepped carefully around the folder, and settled against her forearm with the unsentimental warmth of an animal who simply knows where the heat is. She sat there for another hour. She did not cry. She did not rehearse. She simply let the decision exist in the room with her until it felt like hers completely. Diane's office on Peachtree Street was on the 11th floor of a building with a view of Midtown that Margaret Ashworth had always liked. Vivian arrived at 8:55. She was wearing a navy coat she had not worn since before the surgery, one that fit the way her body was now, fuller in the shoulders, softer at the waist. And she had not spent a single moment that morning apologizing to herself for this. Diane was already at the table with 3 manila folders and a yellow legal pad. She did not offer coffee or small talk. She offered information, which was what Vivian had come for. The sequence was methodical. Proxy vote documentation. 2 forms, straightforward, requiring Vivian's signature as sole trustee. The 2 independent board member nominations. Candidates Diane had identified 6 weeks earlier in anticipation of exactly this conversation. The conduct review trigger, which would activate automatically upon the board's first session under the new composition, the Meridian offer status. Moving toward public announcement, Diane estimated 3 to 4 weeks, possibly sooner once the ownership structure became part of the meeting record. Vivian listened to all of it without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both procedural, both about timing. Diane answered both in 2 sentences each. Then Vivian signed where Diane indicated. Each signature placed with the unhurried attention of a woman who understood what a signature meant. When she finished, Diane gathered the documents, aligned them with the edge of the table, and placed them in a new folder labeled Simply Aft. Proxy April 20th. Tegan. "Is there anything else?" Diane said. "No," Vivian said. "That's everything." She stood, collected her coat, and hooked the cane over her wrist. Diane walked her to the elevator and pressed the button and waited beside her without filling the silence with anything unnecessary. When the doors opened, Vivian stepped in. Diane said, "I'll call you the morning of." "Thank you, Diane," Vivian said. The elevator descended. The lobby opened into Peachtree Street, and the April morning was clear and mild, the light coming in at the angle it does in Atlanta in spring, low and gold and unhurried. Vivian walked to her car at her own pace. Not the pace of someone diminished, not the pace of someone in a hurry to prove anything, simply her own pace, which had always been steadier than people gave her credit for. 11 days then, the shareholders' meeting. Everything she and Diane had discussed would happen in sequence. In a room Roland believed he still controlled. At a table he thought he had removed her from permanently. 11 days was not a long time. She had been patient for years. She could be patient for 11 more days. The Crane Group boardroom occupied the entire northeast corner of the 14th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Midtown Atlanta and a table that seated 16. Roland had chosen the room himself when the building was renovated in 2016, had specified the table dimensions and the chair upholstery, and the way the morning light would fall across the east-facing glass. He had held every significant meeting of the company's recent history in this room. He knew it the way a man knows territory he believes he owns. He did not know Vivian and Diane were coming. His attorney, a compact man named Stuart Price of Caldwell and Price, had been told the agenda was a routine Q1 review and board housekeeping. Roland had told him nothing else because Roland did not know anything else. He was seated at the head of the table at 8:58 reviewing notes on his phone when the boardroom door opened and Vivian walked in. He looked up. The expression that crossed his face lasted less than 2 seconds before he composed it, but it was there. Confusion first, then something that recalibrated quickly into the managerial certainty he defaulted to under pressure. He said, "This meeting isn't open to outside parties." Diane set her briefcase on the table and opened it without looking at him. "Ms. Ashworth is not an outside party," she said. "She is the meeting's majority stakeholder. We'll begin when the board chair is ready." Stuart Price leaned toward Roland. They exchanged 4 words. Roland's jaw tightened. Price raised his hand. "We'd like to request a brief recess to review the basis for that characterization before proceedings begin." The board chair, a man named Thomas Hartley, who had held the position for 9 years and who had a reputation for procedural precision that bordered on the devotional, looked over his reading glasses and said, "The meeting is called. We'll proceed." The room went still. Diane placed the first document on the table, a single page, clean, with a Sorrell and Associates header and a date of March the 15th. She read aloud, "The Ashworth Family Trust, established 1991, Vivian Margaret Ashworth, sole trustee since October 2019, holder of 53% of Crane Group's Class A, voting shares as structured in the original founding capitalization of March 1994. She placed the original 1994 capitalization summary beside it. 30 years old, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, the numbers unambiguous. No one spoke for a moment. Stuart Price said carefully, "These documents would need to be independently verified before they were filed with the Georgia Secretary of State in 1994 and have been annually renewed since," Diane said. "The verification is in tab 3. She placed tab 3 on the table. Roland was looking at the capitalization summary. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something he has seen before, but never read. Not with shock exactly, but with the specific expression of someone understanding for the first time that a familiar object has always said something he wasn't paying attention to. His name was there. His 47% was there. And above it, in the same typeface predating everything else, Ashworth Family Trust, 53.0% Class A. Vivian did not watch him read it. She was looking at Thomas Hartley, who was looking at the documents with the focused attention of a man who understood precisely what they meant. "Ms. Ashworth," Hartley said, "as majority trustee, you are entitled to exercise your proxy vote at this meeting." Clear's throat. "Do you wish to do so?" "Yes," Vivian said. Her voice was even. No ceremony in it, just the word. The proxy vote took 11 minutes to execute. 2 independent board members, Dr. Celia Park, a corporate governance specialist from Emory's business faculty, and James Okonkwo, a retired infrastructure attorney with 30 years of fiduciary experience, were formally installed. Both had been nominated by Vivian's proxy filing. Both confirmations passed. Roland's attorney objected twice. Thomas Hartley noted both objections for the record and continued. Then Diane placed the second set of documents on the table. She did not announce what they were. She simply laid them in front of the newly constituted board, 1 page at a time, with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who has been waiting a long time to do exactly this. The Crane Group website history piece, Kristen's article, printed and dated, 3 presentation decks from 2020 through 2022, each one showing the progressive removal of Margaret Ashworth's name from the founding narrative, and then the Slack thread. 14 exchanges between Roland Crane and Kristen Haas, IT retained, time-stamped, printed on standard paper, and entirely legible to everyone in the room. The relevant exchange was highlighted. Kristen's message, "Vivian is the founding wife, not the founding partner." That distinction matters for the company's public identity. Roland's reply on the line below it, in the clean, sans-serif font of a corporate messaging platform, "Exactly." The irony is sharp. The man who spent 4 years erasing a name from the record had committed his rationale to writing in a system his own IT department archived. James Okonkwo read the thread without expression. Dr. Celia Park made a single note on her legal pad. Thomas Hartley said, "Board counsel will flag the relevant provisions of Mr. Crane's employment contract." The company's general counsel, a woman named Rebecca Sands, who had been silent in the corner until this moment, opened a folder she had clearly already prepared and began reading section 14 to 100 aloud. The misconduct clause with its specific carve-out for reputational damage to founding stakeholders. Drafted in 1994 at Margaret Ashworth's insistence, Rowland had signed it. He had signed it 30 years ago and again in every amended employment agreement since, because it had never occurred to him that it would matter. Diane placed one final document on the table. The independent medical timeline, Dr. Patricia Lowe's clinical notes, the original referral denials, the 18-month gap between first complaint and surgical intervention, documented in the dry language of medical records that is more devastating for its neutrality. It was entered as supplementary pattern evidence for the conduct review. It would remain in the record. Rowland's operational authority was suspended pending review. His title was intact. His sign-off authority was not. He sat at the head of the table in the room he had designed and did not move. Kristen Haas had been present as VP of Communications, seated at the far end of the table. Present because she had not known what the meeting would become, because no one had told her, because no one had needed to. When Rebecca Sands finished reading the employment clause and noted that the conduct review would encompass all communications related to the public rebranding initiative, Kristen's posture changed. It was subtle, a small settling, like something being quietly recalibrated. She closed her notebook. She gathered her phone. She rose from her chair with the composed deliberateness of someone who has already decided on the door and is simply walking toward it. Rowland watched her go. His eyes tracked her all the way to the door. She did not look back. The room was very quiet after that. Rowland turned to Vivian. Something had shifted in his face. Not the managerial composure, which had eroded steadily over the past 20 minutes, but something underneath it, something older. He said, "You're destroying what we built, everything I built. You know what this company cost me?" Vivian looked at him for a long moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not require the room's attention. She simply said, with the calm of a woman who has already decided that this is the last time she will explain anything to him, "You built on my mother's name. The least you could do is learn to say it." Thomas Hartley called a 5-minute recess. Board members shifted in their chairs. Stuart Price began speaking quietly to Rowland, who was not listening. Vivian stood, collected her coat from the back of her chair, and walked to where Diane was already closing her briefcase. They left the boardroom together and took the elevator to the lobby, where Gerald was at his desk and the plaque was on the wall. Still there, still brass, still reading exactly what it had always read. Vivian paused in front of it for one moment, the way she had paused 11 days ago, when it had been the only true thing in the room. Then she and Diane walked through the glass doors and into the April morning. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, the Meridian Capital Group acquisition offer went public. By noon, it was the most discussed story in Atlanta's business press. The number was everywhere, $53.4 billion, and in every piece, in every analysis, in every headline that tried to explain where a mid-market Atlanta infrastructure company had generated that kind of institutional interest from a London consortium. One name kept appearing as the foundational explanation: Ashworth. Rowland read it on his phone, alone in the room he had designed, at the table he had chosen. He had never once in 30 years read the founding documents closely enough to understand what they said. The weeks after the shareholders' meeting moved quickly for everyone, except Vivian, who had no reason to hurry. Rowland's conduct review concluded in 6 weeks. The board's determination was clean and documented. Material misrepresentation in public filings regarding the company's founding history, financial restructuring that had demonstrably disadvantaged a founding stakeholder, and a pattern of conduct incompatible with Section 14-100 of his employment agreement. The clause Margaret Ashworth had insisted on in 1994 that Rowland had signed 30 years ago without reading carefully. His employment contract was terminated. He retained his minor minority equity position, valued independently at $340 million, which was meaningful and which was not what he had expected. He did not release a public statement. His attorney released one on his behalf that said the parties had reached a mutually acceptable resolution. It was not accurate, but no one was in a position to correct it yet. Kristen Haas had already been gone for 3 weeks by then. Her resignation had been accepted the same afternoon she walked out of the boardroom. Effective immediately, the 2 PR agencies she consulted for had followed the news cycle with the attentive pragmatism of organizations that understand how proximity works, and neither had renewed her agreements when they expired. Her name was removed from the Crane Group website within 48 hours of the conduct review's conclusion. The press retraction, mandated by the board and published on the company's site, restored Margaret Ashworth's name to the founding narrative in full founding partner, majority stakeholder, originating visionary, and corrected the characterization of Vivian's departure from a mutual restructuring to what it actually was. Several people in Atlanta's business community read it carefully. Several of them called people they knew. Eleanor Crane called Vivian's sister Camille twice in the week after the shareholders' meeting, both times with the careful concern of a woman recalibrating her position. Camille did not return either call. Eleanor did not call a third time. She did not call anyone in the family again. Whatever she told her own circle about what had happened, she told it quietly, in the vocabulary of inevitability, as if the outcome had always been obvious, and she had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. This was Eleanor's way. She had never once in her life been the person who lost, except that she was. She just never said so. 3 weeks after the shareholders' meeting on a Tuesday morning that was already warm for May, Vivian was in the garden at Margaret's house, her house, deadheading the roses along the back fence when she heard the gate. She straightened. Through the kitchen window, she could see Diane already at the table. Right on time. The folder open in front of her. Vivian had called her the previous Thursday. The way you call someone when something is about to happen and you want the right person in the room when it does. She walked around to the front. Roland was on the path wearing the expression she had identified months ago, the particular set of his jaw that meant he had convinced himself the situation was still recoverable. Beside him was a man in a gray suit carrying a leather portfolio. Franklin Rowe of Rowe and Castleton. She recognized the name from his business card, which he extended to her with the smooth efficiency of a man who bills, clears throat in 6-minute increments and wastes none of them. Franklin Rowe presented his argument on her porch. He was precise and thorough and entirely professional. He made the case for Roland's operational contribution as a form of marital partnership, entitling him to consideration in any disposition of the Ashworth Trust's majority position. He cited 30 years. He cited the Meridian valuation. He used the word fair twice, which was 2 times more than the situation warranted. Vivian listened to all of it with her cane hooked over her wrist and her weight balanced evenly on both feet. When he finished, she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "Diane is already here." The scene at the kitchen table did not take long. Diane presented the documents in the order she had assembled them. The 1994 founding capitalization, Roland's employment agreements spanning 3 decades, each one defining his role as operational and explicitly non-ownership based, and then, last, placed with a particular care of something that has been kept safe for a very long time, a letter. 2 pages handwritten in Margaret Ashworth's deliberate script, dated September 2018 and notarized by Diane the same afternoon it was written. Franklin Rowe read it slowly. He read it to the end. The company was never half his. Make sure the paper says so when it matters. The leather portfolio closed. The sound it made was very small, the quiet kitchen. Roland looked at Vivian across the table. Something moved through his face that was not the performance of reasonableness he had defaulted to for years. Something older and more complicated. The recognition of a man who has finally read the document he should have read 30 years ago. He said her name. Just her name. The way he used to say it when they were still the people they had started as. He said she knew better than anyone what he had built. What they had built. Vivian stood in the doorway of her mother's kitchen, her hand light on the doorframe, and looked at the man who had escorted her out of a building, dismissed her pain as anxiety, erased her mother's name from 30 years of history, and arrived at her door with a lawyer to claim a share of something he had never owned. "You build on my mother's name," she said. "The least you could do is learn to say it." Franklin Rowe packed his portfolio. Roland followed him down the path. The gate closed with its small final sound. Diane poured 2 cups of tea without being asked. The Meridian Capital Group acquisition closed 14 months later. Vivian's trustee's share of the $53.4 billion transaction came to $28.3 billion, confirmed, wired, and managed through the Ashworth Family Trust with the same structural discipline Margaret had established in 1994. Vivian did not hold a press conference. She did not issue a statement. She donated $2 million to the Margaret Ashworth Women's Orthopedic Health Initiative at Emory University Hospital, a fund specifically dedicated to closing the gap between symptom onset and surgical intervention for women whose pain has been attributed to stress. The gift was announced quietly in Margaret's name, and the announcement said nothing about what had made it necessary. The Crane Group building on Peachtree Street was renovated by its new owners in the following year. Among the first things the Meridian team had specified in their operational transition plan, cited in an internal memo as a matter of institutional credibility, was the restoration of the original lobby dedication plaque. It was remounted in its original position, the brass cleaned and relacquered. Ashworth Crane Partners, Esther 1994. Built on the vision of Margaret Ashworth, it had never stopped being true. It had simply been covered over for a while. This is a story about patience, but not the kind that waits for permission. It is a story about what happens when the people who mistake silence for weakness finally encounter the document that silence was protecting. It is a story about a woman who understood, from her mother and from 30 years of watching, that power does not require announcement. It only requires paper and the right signature and enough time for the truth to become undeniable. She never hears from Roland again. She clears throat, does not think about this often. She thinks about Margaret. She thinks about the garden. If this story stayed with you, if you know someone who has been told their silence was weakness or their patience was naivety or their name didn't belong on the door, leave a comment and tell us. And tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight. The last image is this. A morning in early April, the kind that comes to Atlanta with light that is all gold and no weight. Vivian is in the garden her mother planted along the back fence, where the roses Margaret shows are coming back after the winter, with the uncomplicated confidence of things that have simply been given time. The cane is leaning against the doorframe, unused. She does not need it today. She is moving at her own pace, the pace she was always moving at, the pace that everyone around her had mistaken for something else. She does not need to say anything. The paper already said it.